I was grabbing a coffee with an old colleague a few days ago when the news cycle shifted toward the latest escalations with Iran. He looked down at his phone, a slow, satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Finally," he muttered, tapping the screen. "We're finally putting them in their place. No more talking, just a clear message that they lost." He looked up at me, his eyes bright, with a sort of predatory triumph. To him, this wasn't about diplomacy or long-term regional stability. It was about the deep-down satisfaction of seeing a defiant power finally forced to blink. He talked about crushing blows and total victory, as if international relations were a championship boxing match where the loser just stays down and the lights go out. But then I asked him a simple question. What happens the morning after they sign the surrender? His expression flickered. He started talking about imposing terms and making sure they never rise again, using the same confident paternalistic tone that echoed through the gilded halls of Paris in 1919. He saw a world where a few powerful men could simply stop time, draw lines on a map, and dictate the future of millions through sheer humiliation. He didn't see the resentment simmering under the surface. He didn't see the obnoxious seeds being sown in the soil of a vengeful peace. To him, the win was the end of the story. It left me with a chilling sense of déjà vu. It reminded me that the most dangerous moment in any conflict isn't the height of the fighting, but the moment the victors decide to trade a sustainable future for a fleeting moment of spite. We've seen this script before, in the artificial borders of Iraq, the radicalization of Japan, and the rise of the very shadows we fight today. We're standing at the edge of another Versailles moment, convinced that if we just hit hard enough, the world will finally stay still. But history suggests that when you try to end a war with humiliation, you aren't actually finishing a conflict. You're just writing the opening chapter of the next one.
This analysis will systematically unpack the long-term consequences of punitive peace settlements, the architecture of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, and the modern mechanics of economic warfare and international law.
And to really ground this, to grasp the sheer gravity of that architecture, I want you to picture a specific scene. A man named Hans, a small shop owner in 1920s Berlin. He survived the trenches only to return to a city where his life savings were rendered worthless by the shameful Peace of Versailles. He stands in front of his empty storefront, watching foreign officials drive through the streets to enforce reparations. Every time he sees those officials, he doesn't just see a debt to be paid. He feels a physical weight of humiliation, a sense that his nation has been stripped of its dignity by a distant, vengeful hand. He starts attending small, angry meetings in basements, not because he is a radical, but because he feels the world has backed him into a corner where pride is the only thing left to defend. The parallels between Hans's resentment and the modern rhetoric surrounding the containment of adversaries are chilling. When there is talk about crushing a nation's economy or forcing them into total submission, the human cost is often forgotten. The psychological scars of perceived national humiliation can last for generations, proving that a peace designed only to punish is often just a long-term loan for a future war.
Yeah, that narrative of Hans, it really captures the exact psychological mechanism that the architects of the 1919 peace settlement just failed to consider. Or maybe they just disregarded it completely.
Right.
The peace established in Paris in 1919 was, at its very core, an imperial peace. It was designed and executed by men who prioritized national aggrandizement. They were looking at imperial preservation over any real concept of long-term global stability.
Which is wild when you think about the devastation they had just lived through.
You look at the prime ministers of Britain, France, and Italy, David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau, and Vittorio Orlando. They arrived at the Paris Peace Conference not to heal a fractured world, but with the explicit objective of extracting immense tribute from the vanquished nations.
And when we say tribute, we're talking about tangible assets, right?
Absolutely. Massive transfers of commodities, securing access to cheap labor, and the forceful expansion of their own imperial markets. They were engineering a system where the wealth of the defeated would rebuild the empires of the victors. And to do this, they had to actively ignore the framework proposed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson.
Because Wilson arrived advocating for a totally different vision.
Right. He wanted a new world order based on moral principle rather than military power.
But the European powers just completely marginalized that moral framework.
They did. They pursued a highly punitive settlement. The application of self-determination, the whole idea that people should choose their own political future, it was incredibly selective. It was applied based on arbitrary ethnicity and linguistics, creating these artificial nation-states.
Like Yugoslavia.
Yes. Various distinct Balkan ethnic groups were just forced into the unviable state of Yugoslavia. Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, all forced under a single political structure. It directly set the stage for the devastating ethnic cleansing we saw erupt in the 1990s.
It's just drawing lines on a map without looking at who lives there. And we saw the exact same top-down arrogance in the Middle East.
The Middle East is a prime example.
Right. You had the Hashemite Prince Faisal of the Hedjes and T.E. Lawrence arguing for an independent Arab state out of the Ottoman Empire. They understood the local dynamics.
But their pleas were entirely ignored. The European powers sidelined them and established artificial states instead. The creation of Iraq being the textbook case, they assembled disparate groups into an inherently unstable nation, ensuring it would remain dependent on Western control.
Which basically guarantees perpetual instability. But the 1919 framework didn't just redraw borders. It invented entirely new mechanisms for punishment. This is where we see the creation of the League of Nations and the institutionalization of economic sanctions.
The birth of the economic weapon.
Exactly. Woodrow Wilson, in a 1919 speech conceptualizing the boycott, called it something more terrible than war, where a nation is absolutely closed. I mean, he's presenting the boycott as this instrument of total devastation.
And that conceptual shift is massive. It shifted global conflict from direct military confrontation to economic strangulation. What's insidious is how it was framed. Sanctions became categorized as a peacetime punishment for wartime aggression.
So you could destroy a nation's infrastructure, collapse its economy, but claim you were engaging in peaceful diplomacy because no bullets were fired.
It allowed powerful nations to deploy devastating economic weapons without declaring war. They bypassed legal constraints and domestic backlash. It became a sanitized way to wage war under the guise of maintaining international peace.
That structural hypocrisy had global fallout. In 1919, a young Chinese student named Li stood in the middle of a crowded Beijing square. He had been a firm believer in the Western promise of self-determination, hoping the Paris Peace Conference would end colonial exploitation. He receives the news that the powers had decided to hand over Chinese territories to Japan instead of returning them to the Chinese people. The betrayal is visceral. He takes his Western textbooks and throws them into a bonfire, realizing the New World Order was never meant for him or his people. This moment of disillusionment was the exact second that a century of mistrust between the East and the West was born, shifting his gaze toward more radical, revolutionary alternatives. Our current global instability is rooted in these old wounds of racial and regional inequality. When the rules of fairness are applied selectively, the result is a massive geopolitical backlash. You cannot build a stable world if you tell half the population that their rights are secondary. The failure to live up to stated ideals in 1919 created the adversaries face today.
That narrative of Li is crucial because it perfectly illustrates the failure of punitive, unequal international frameworks. And connecting the underlying lesson of Li's disillusionment to contemporary statecraft requires us to look closely at U.S.-Iran relations. It is explicitly necessary to state here that this analysis does not endorse the viewpoints of any nation involved, but is strictly reporting the mechanisms of international relations.
Of course, purely looking at the mechanics.
Right. And the mechanics of contemporary economic warfare are strikingly similar to 1919. Modern sanctions operate under the guise of liberal humanist values, things like non-proliferation or protecting human rights, while actually functioning as a devastating form of warfare.
It's often justified by what's called the capitalist peace theory, right?
Exactly. The theory argues that international commerce encourages peace. So international law has historically tied commerce to pacific relations. This logic makes economic blockades a tool of outcasting. You position the targeted nation as an enemy of global peace, and economic strangulation becomes the enforcement mechanism used to compel them back into compliance.
We saw the extreme end of this in the 1990s with the UN sanctions against Iraq, an oil embargo that caused a massive macroeconomic shock. It destroyed public expenditure and infrastructure. It effectively prepared the ground for the 2003 military invasion by completely normalizing Iraqi suffering.
A textbook example of outcasting. And there's a direct parallel to the current sanctions on Iran. They are framed as peacetime containment, but they inflict devastating civilian costs. The historian Peter Frankopan offers a stark warning here. He argues that attempting to end the conflict via sheer humiliation risks a modern Versailles moment.
Thinking that hitting them hard enough economically will force submission.
Right, but history shows punitive approaches don't resolve tensions. They foster resentment and lay the groundwork for future conflicts. The economic weapon might be bloodless in its immediate application, but the systemic toll mirrors the impacts of armed conflict.
And to really understand that generational toll, I want you to imagine a family living in the rugged borderlands between what we now call Iraq and Iran, whose ancestors saw men in a gilded room in Paris draw a line through their ancestral grazing lands with a ruler and a pen. An elderly Kurdish shepherd remembers his father describing the day the line appeared. Before 1919, the border was a fluid thing of culture and trade. After Versailles, it became a scar of barbed wire and bureaucracy. This arbitrary division turned neighbors into foreigners and created a vacuum where only identity politics and extremism could thrive. The family's history is traced through decades of cross-border skirmishes and the rise of local militias, born from a map drawn by distant people. There is a direct line from those 1919 ink strokes to modern volatility. Top-down geopolitical solutions often fail to account for the ground-level reality of human connection. Conflicts seen as good versus evil are often the legacy of a century-old failure to respect local history. When attempts are made to fix regions through forced settlements, it is often just tracing over the same broken lines drawn in 1919. Peace requires a recognition of the people living within the lines.
The shepherd's story highlights the incredibly destructive nature of exclusionary, top-down Western policymaking. And we have to apply this lesson to the treatment of East Asia at the Paris Peace Conference to fully grasp the global impact.
Because Japan's position at that conference was totally unique.
They were the only non-Western power recognized among the major victors. And they earned that seat through massive military expeditions during World War I. They declared war on Germany in 1914, mobilized 52,000 troops to capture Qingdao in the Shandong Peninsula.
They didn't just stop there.
No, they occupied German islands in Micronesia, the Marshalls, Carolines, and Marianas, and they deployed a staggering 73,000 troops in the Siberian intervention.
So they arrive in Paris with the credentials of a global superpower. They were seated as one of the big five.
Yes, alongside the US, Britain, France, and Italy. But they were acutely aware of the racial hierarchies of the time.
Which leads to the racial equality proposal, presented to the League of Nations Commission on February 13, 1919, by Makino Nobuaki. He demanded equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction, either in law or in fact, on account of their race or nationality.
A direct challenge to the ideological foundation of European colonialism.
And what's crazy is that it actually passed the vote. 11 of the 17 delegates voted in favor.
A clear majority, but the opposition was fierce. Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes forcefully defended the White Australia policy, stating that 95 out of 100 Australians rejected the very idea of equality.
And the British delegation backed him up.
They prioritized imperial unity over principle, but since it had a majority, it took Woodrow Wilson to kill it. He acted as chairman and suddenly declared a unanimous vote was required, completely overturning the clear majority.
Just changing the rules to ensure it failed, the hypocrisy is staggering.
The fallout was monumental. It caused deep Japanese alienation. They realized Western powers envisioned permanent white supremacy. This rejection caused Japan's subsequent turn away from the West toward Pan-Asianism, militarism, and eventually the path directly to World War II.
The structural guarantee of future conflict. It's the same architecture division we see in the Middle East. The 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement and the 1917 Balfour Declaration.
Those secret agreements were formalized through the League of Nations mandate system. It was allegedly designed to govern territories until they can stand alone. Practically, it became a tool of colonial administration. Britain controlling Palestine and Iraq, France controlling Syria and Lebanon.
And addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we must view this purely through the objective lens of international law and the historical documents provided, taking no sides. The UN passed a series of resolutions attempting to manage these entrenched colonial legacies.
Let's trace those resolutions. In 1948, Resolution 194 regarding refugee rights and compensation. Then, in 1967, Resolution 242 establishing the Land for Peace framework post-Six-Day War.
Moving forward, Resolution 1397 in 2002 calling for a two-state solution. Resolution 1860 in 2009 regarding the Gaza ceasefire, and Resolution 2334 in 2016 declaring settlements a violation of international law.
When you analyze the efficacy of these resolutions, a stark dichotomy emerges. They successfully established binding legal norms and human rights frameworks.
But their practical enforcement is practically non-existent.
Exactly. The lack of practical enforcement demonstrates the profound difficulty of applying international law in firmly rooted conflicts born from colonial partition.
Which brings us to the academic framework of analyzing modern sanctions and blockades as an extension of colonial governance. It's this concept of bio-necro-collaboration.
To understand this, we have to distinguish between spectacular violence, traditional warfare like bombing campaigns, and slow violence. Slow violence is the incremental devastation inflicted by resource deprivation and economic strangulation.
The violence of a collapsed power grid.
And this ties into the theory of necropolitics, where biopolitical control and the proximity of life and death are intertwined. The 17-year blockade of Gaza is the cited academic example of this bio-necro-collaboration, an economy deliberately kept on the brink of total collapse.
And there are global ramifications to these sanctions networks. We see grassroots movements utilizing the same mechanisms in response. Movements like BDS boycott, divestment, and sanctions utilize economic leverage from a grassroots level as a counterpoint to state-imposed blockades.
Synthesizing all of this, the overarching threads become very clear. The punitive architecture of 1919 created artificial borders and racial disenfranchisement, directly leading to a century of conflict. The shift from military warfare to economic sanctions allowed nations to wage devastating campaigns under the guise of peacetime policy. And the rigid enforcement of top-down international law continues to grapple, often unsuccessfully, with the incredibly complex realities of local populations.
The historical record shows that humiliation and punitive exclusion do not conclude conflicts, but merely alter their form. When economic strangulation and artificial divisions are utilized to enforce submission, the resulting peace is inherently unstable. You are left witnessing a cycle where the mechanisms of total victory continually lay the groundwork for the next generation's wars.